You're listening in on an animated discussion about Superman the Animated Series with two experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
And I'm Caleb Masters, your friendly neighborhood film critic extraordinaire from the Mxyzptlk.com. And today's topic is Mxyzpxilated. Joshua, I'm going to say this one time, and only because you were so kind as to phonetically spell it out for me so that I would not get it incorrect when saying it on this show. His name is I can't even say it right for the teaser. It's Mxyzptlk.
Almost. You're still saying split, and it's spit.
I said spitlick. Okay, whatever. The listeners will be the judge. We'll take it. I'm not saying, for reference, we'll just shorten it up. Mr. Mxy. Yes.
Mxy is good. We can just say Mxy. I mean, look, the fact is, and frankly, I loved this bit, but the fact is the episode had to have him explain how to say his name because so many of us had just been reading it for most of our lives, although they did say it on Super Friends, and we'll talk a little more about Super Friends, but they also said it a little differently. So that'll just tell you that there's no one way to do it except in terms of one show. And Superman the Animated Series definitely prefers Mxyzptlk. And it's really hard not to say splitlick.
Yes, Mxyzptlk. There we go. There's my one. I got it. Mxyzptlk.
You got it. Now move on. From now on, it's Mxy unless we're feeling froggy and think we can get away with it. So
I do have to say, though, this is part of, I mean, as far as I can tell, not knowing the comics history outside of a few appearances here and there, not knowing really the in-depth comics history of this, of Mxy, again, I would say that from what I understand, the point is that it's supposed to be very hard to pronounce because it's supposed to be from another dimension that is beyond comprehension to us four-dimensional creatures.
That's true. That's basically true. Absolutely. He is a fifth dimensional sorcerer or scientist, which might mean the same thing in the fifth dimension, or that might just be what we say to cover up the fact that they haven't been entirely consistent since 1944, because it has shifted a little bit, from time to time. But yes, his name is really hard to say because either they don't have vowels at all in the fifth dimension, or, and again, different stories at different times, you earn vowels and they are a sign of your rank. And Mxy gets himself into a lot of trouble in the fifth dimension. He's really not supposed to be screwing around with us fourth dimensional people that much.
He just can't help himself, though. I mean, apparently he's been messing with us for quite some time, so long that he actually got bored until he met Superman.
That's right. Again, depending on different versions, but yes, that's definitely one of the versions that he's been around for a while, that most of the myths that you have about genies or jinn or leprechauns, that kind of thing, are either Mxy himself or other pranksters from the fifth dimension in his, style, because he's not the only, as we'll discuss when we get to my alternate media recommendation, he's not the only fifth dimensional being in the DC universe. So, but yes, basically, he's been around for a while, messing around with everybody, and Superman is defo his favorite guy to mess around with.
Yes. So, Joshua, here's the thing. I have a lot of questions, and I'm hoping you can just fill me in, because I have read this character in several various comics. He typically, I've seen him, read him in some events comics, where he kind of pops up here and there. Not only does the version of this character of Mxy that appears in Superman the Animated Series look a lot different than how I've seen him in the comics, but he seems way more comedic here than where I've seen him elsewhere. So if you could elaborate, has this character always quite as influenced by, the comic strips of the Golden Age?
Yes, he's actually, believe it or not, a Golden Age character originally, although his more recognizable look was definitely a thing that they did to update him in the Silver Age, kind of make him look a little more science fiction-y. But what I love about this, okay, I kind of have to get in my Wayback Machine and tell you that my first multimedia brush with Mxy is on the old Super Friends and Superpowers cartoons. Okay? So when I was a very little guy, there was Super Friends, which are the ones that you get the most jokes about, right? Like every single jerk who thinks he's the first one to decide that talking to fish is a dumb power points to Super Friends to make fun of Aquaman. And Super Friends is the show that they point to when they're like, why does anybody else show up? They've got Superman, right? Superpowers is the late 80s, more serious, like I don't want to say super serious, but more serious attempt at the DC superheroes, at the Justice League. And that's the one, I think I've mentioned it before when we talked about Brainiac, is that on Superpowers is when you get the like scary metal skeleton Brainiac, and you get the like disco collar Lex Luthor becomes power armor Lex Luthor, and then you also get Darkseid. He's the bad guy. We'll talk more about that a little later in Superman. And you also get the more recognizable look of Mxy, which, if I'm guessing right, the one that you're more familiar with is the kind of orange jumpsuit,
yes,
with a purple derby, right? And he looks a lot more sinister. Like he looks like a
way more sinister.
Like a thin, angrier Don Rickles, right?
I never thought of him as a Don Rickles comparison, but that is correct. Yeah, his I always think his hair is very pointy. He does have hair in other versions. Either his hair is pointy or he's got elfish looking ears, very pointy. Yeah, and he always looks way more sinister than he does in Superman the Animated Series.
So by the 70s and 80s, they were playing him as a lot more sinister. Like he was still a prankster, but he was like a prankster who didn't mind if people got hurt, right? Which he's a little bit in the Golden Age also, but the Golden Age stories were just a little more, I don't know, fanciful, a little more fairy tale, so that the things that he would do to mess with Superman were prankish, very much like this episode, where people are being affected, right? Don't get me wrong. They're being affected, but they're not like being directly hurt. By the time you get to kind of that Superpowers era, which is, in the comics starting in the 70s, and then Superpowers was a mid to late 80s cartoon, you have, as I say, a more sinister look. He looks more angry. He's still impish, but it's impish in a more... Demonic is too strong, but I think you can say imp and mean like this guy in this episode who's got very rounded features, rounded ears, and is just like short and weird. And then you can get into kind of the more sinister impish where the ears are pointed and more elfin, and he's just more angry, and he's just floating around, just ready to actually do some violence as part of his prank. So you're more familiar with that guy.
Yes.
What I loved about this take is that, I could just imagine, I'd actually like to have been a fly on the wall when they were talking about this, but I can imagine that they were like, okay, it's been 10 years since we've had a Superman cartoon. We need to introduce these villains that were on this one that was 10 or 15 years ago, but we want them to be distinct. We don't want them to at all make people think of that other cartoon because that other cartoon was not as good as ours, which is all true. Like, I liked Superpowers and I had a ton of those toys, but quality-wise, Superman the Animated Series is a quantum leap. And what I love about this is that instead of just redesigning him entirely, they actually go back to his original Golden Age look. The look of Mxy on this episode is 95% exactly the same as his first appearance in 1944. Instead of this kind of like sci-fi look that they gave him when all comics kind of moved into the Silver Age and everything got a lot more science fiction-y. I've mentioned that before. That's when they reintroduced Flash and Green Lantern as science fiction heroes instead of as basically magic heroes. They let Batman go off planet. He does a lot of interstellar travel. Like everything got more science fiction-y in the Silver Age. And that's when you got the Mxy you're familiar with. This episode goes all the way back in the Wayback Machine and just gives us a funny little guy in a 3-piece purple suit with a derby just barely hanging onto his giant head. So yeah, fantastic pull, I think, for this show.
Well, and we absolutely we can't forget that outside of the very distinct look, the casting of Gilbert Gottfried, who at that point in time was riding the fame of Aladdin, where he voiced Iago as the as the voice of this character is chef's kiss. It's perfect. It's so funny, and it's lighthearted, and it really does feel taken right from the golden age of comics, like the comic strips, almost like a Roadrunner style, where you would see just a few panels of him like pranking somebody. I don't know. I think this is a really charming take, and I will say, upon doing some research here, apparently this is Paul Dini's favorite episode that he did on Superman the Animated Series, according to him on a DVD commentary.
I wouldn't be surprised at all. I mean, Dini really is like a deep bench Superman guy, and I don't want to make it seem like Mxy is some unknown, forgotten character, but he is one that gets, let's say, benched or put on the shelf quite a lot in modern comics, because modern comics are not allowed to have fun. And yes, I'm being a little reductive, but hey, not as reductive as you think. Like, modern comics do not know what to do with a prankster imp. If they can't have him like literally show up and rip people to shreds with his fifth dimensional powers, they don't know what to do with them. And I hate that, but there it is.
No, totally. We're different podcasts, but yes, comic books are for adults, Joshua. They are very serious pop culture. You should not be diminishing them. Also, if you really did want to do the dark, gritty take on Mxy, I would just say, hey, let's read The Monkey's Paw and somehow work that into the story somewhere if it hasn't already been done, which it probably has been, but
They kind of did a darker Mxy. They did an Emperor Joker story that involves Mxy. And again, I really want to save it because Mxy is not technically part of the story, but they do so much with the fifth dimension in it. My alternate media recommendation is actually like, here's how you treat fifth dimensional stuff extremely seriously while recognizing that Mxy is a friggin' goofball, right? We'll get to it. It's not as hard a balance beam as it seems, but much like you hear a lot of modern comic book writers say that Superman is too hard to write because he's too powerful or whatever, I'm like, yeah, this is you being bad at Superman. Is the same thing that happens to Mxy. Just to circle around, Gilbert Gottfried, I'm with you. The perfect voice casting for this, and is the most 90s casting choice you could imagine for Mxy.
100%. Does anyone even know if I went to kids on the street today, they would have no clue who he is. If I went to kids on the street 10 years ago, they wouldn't know who he was if they didn't hear the voice.
Definitely.
So yes, 90s-tastic casting all around. So Joshua, one thing I want to hit on here, especially I know we're talking about design and history. I just have to say, again, not knowing personally like all the things that he's done in the comics, just again on his face, it sounds like he is one of the most powerful villains in Superman's rogues gallery that just doesn't really use his powers. He just likes to prank people. But the guy can, at least in this episode, manipulate reality. He can, not even the snap of a finger. Like he can morph reality. He can sort of make people see things that aren't real. I just think.
Oh no, it's worse, my friend. They're all real when he does it. Like that's what's happening when he's doing it. He just makes everybody forget and resets everything to make Superman think he's going nuts.
It's great.
It's not an image. It's not I want to make this clear. It is not an illusion. He is literally warping reality. And the theory here I kind of like, because this is like just enough sort of kind of real science, just enough. Like, let me ask you, I'll take a step back. Have you read or are you familiar with a book called Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions?
I have not read this book.
Okay. A lot of people have not. I have no idea why I had. I was familiar with it, from a relatively young age. And just the short version of it is, it basically covers a two-dimensional world occupied by two-dimensional geometric figures, right? Mm-hmm. Just like we're three-dimensional. We're three-dimensional, but move through a fourth and then do other things to higher dimensions. But we're gonna focus on the fact that we live and exist in three and move in one direction through the fourth, right? And so Flatland it was written in the late 1800s, like 1884, I believe it when it was published. And what you start to see are interactions between a third dimension being and these second dimensional shapes, right? But it's impossible. Like all they can see is a single point, right? Where the third dimensional creature is touching their universe. And so basically the fact that you can muck around in a dimension or two higher, it is suggested that you basically can do whatever you want to the reality of those that exist in lower dimensions, which makes a certain amount of sense, right? Like if you have somebody who is now, like let's describe Mxyz like I described us. We're third dimensional creatures who move in one direction to a fourth dimension. Well, fourth dimension is time. So if he's a fifth dimensional creature, he is now a creature that exists in 5 dimensions and then moves in one direction through the 6th and then does other things to the higher dimensions. He can just maneuver stuff around here. We're just lesser to him.
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't even say we're ants. Like you said, we're just like dots on a dot-to-dot sheet, Like it is a nothing. So even though Superman, as powerful as he may be, because he experiences reality the same way humans do, he is met with the same limitations as a normal human.
Right. He's essentially a normal guy as far as Mxyz's concerned, because Mxyz can do whatever he wants. Now, as far as not using his powers to the utmost, there are explanations for this over the course of all this comic book history, and some are better than others, right? Like my favorite is that they don't bother to explain it at all. Like he just shows up and he does what he wants, and because comics can also be fun, nobody asks why he's not straight up murdering people, right? Like clearly there are rules he has to follow anyway, because if he says his name backwards, he goes back to his home dimension, and he can only show up every 90 days, right? So clearly there are rules. And once you get past that kind of fairy tale point, you start to have a description of the 5th dimension where they're really not supposed to be mucking around down here. So they get in a little bit of trouble when they do, but it's not a lot of trouble, as long as they keep it at the level of mischief. But if they come down here and start doing real damage, then almost like we are, animals in a nature preserve, the powers that be of the 5th dimensional imps will be like, excuse me, you're now in a lot of trouble, right? Which there have been some stories where Mxyz gets in that level of trouble. So yeah, there are just rules, and you can have them be whatever you want them to be. Like they are what they are. Why are they? We can't explain it. They're 5th dimensional, They don't experience time like us, but he's still locked into this 90-day cycle. Why? I don't know. 5th dimensional rules.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. At least for part of the episode, the game he plays as Superman, the rules are self-imposed. Because Superman, that's part of Superman's trick, right? Well, there has to be rules, right? There has to. If we're going to play a game, there's got to be rules.
Yes.
Yes. So now are those pre-imposed on Mxyz, or or does he put them on himself so that he can sort of play around with Superman?
Okay, in the beginning, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? He both is locked into that 90-day cycle, which seems to be a thing imposed from without. He can't break that one. If I say my name backwards, I'll go home, appears at the beginning to be a rule he sets for himself to make a game with Superman. Now, as the years pass, that shifts a little bit. As you get a little bit more of the lore around these 5th dimensional imps, it becomes clear that actually their names are extremely powerful, which, again, magic or science, what does it matter? It's just reality, honestly. They always talk about him as a 5th dimensional sorcerer or a 5th dimensional scientist, and I'm like, he just has to be a 5th dimensional jerk. Like, I don't need a bunch of special knowledge to go mess with one-dimensional creatures. I just have to be me, right? But as you get a little more of the lore around the 5th dimension, you start to realize names are extremely important to them. Again, sometimes the vowels become something that shows rank. Sometimes. That's very rare, but it's around. And you start to even get stories where Superman decides to go to the 5th dimension and mess with Mxyz in the way that Mxyz does to him. And then when he's ready to come home, he has to say his name backwards. Superman has to say his name backwards, and then he comes home. So it's a little catch as catch can. I like my own personal headcanon for this episode, which is that the rules are all the rules for everybody in the 5th dimension, but Mxyz makes it look like he's imposing some of them on him, because how the heck would Superman know, first of all? And secondly, now it's a game, right?
Right. And I think that is, I don't feel like we often get to see Superman use his wit to win.
Yes.
And this was a really great opportunity for him to both be playful while also being smarter than his opponent, who is actually significantly more powerful than him. So I don't know. It just was a really great showcase of what Superman's capable of, even without his powers, right? He just has to...
100%.
Yeah.
It's not just his intelligence, although it is. Like, he's obviously very clever, but I think it's also Superman's emotional intelligence, which is always the thing that I really personally want to play at, because he's the son of a scientist on Krypton, and obviously Pa Kent is no dummy, and he has a super brain, like literally the Earth's yellow sun supercharges his mind also, but he's not a person who is sort of known for his intelligence, if that makes sense, right? Like, he's got it, but it's not where he puts his focus, because, and I really like this explanation too a lot of the time, he doesn't have time. Science takes time, right? He doesn't have time. He's very busy Supermaning around the place. And so for me, what I love most is that at the end, after beating Mxy with all these clever ideas, in the end, he beats Mxy with emotional intelligence. Well, I'm just going to treat you like a toddler, and you're going to react like a toddler, and then I can just trick you into doing whatever I want, because you're a toddler. And he's right. Superman is 100% right. Mxy is a toddler.
Yeah. I mean, in this episode, for sure. The way he throws fits whenever he loses or accidentally says his name backwards or whatnot. It's really great. It's a great showcase of Superman, and I kind of hope that we see a little more of this throughout the series elsewhere. I mean, obviously not exactly, but exactly in this scenario, but there's got to be more opportunities for Superman to show his maturity, apparently.
Oh, yeah,
and also his
That's
wit.
a good way to think about that. His emotional intelligence and emotional maturity over Mxy, who clearly has neither. Like, just does not have any.
And then weirdly has a supermodel wife, girlfriend, partner, whose name I'm not even going to attempt to say the name of, but what a weird character.
I got you. I will do it. Her name is Mxyzptlk.
Say that 5 times fast.
Mxyzptlk. I think that was 5. Not
Holy
bad.
cow.
Not
I couldn't
bad.
believe you actually tried. Kudos,
Okay.
sir.
Again, I've had a lot of practice at this. I was actually saying Mxyzptlk when I was like 7 years old.
This is the day you've been training for, Joshua.
Little did I realize. Yeah. It's really worth bringing her up, though, Caleb, because she is actually also a character from the comic books, and she is a very important bit player, I guess, like a really important secondary character in my alternate media recommendation. And sometimes she is shown to be like his girlfriend or wife or Quinto partner. That's a way that they talk about her sometimes. And let me say the one really good thing I love about Mxyzptlk in this episode, which is, did you notice who played her voice?
I actually didn't even look. Who was it? Remind me.
It's Sandra Bernhardt.
Oh, goodness. How did they get her for this?
Which is the other most 90s casting you could do.
Yeah. Oh, man. They really went for the fences on. But I mean, here's the thing: it is 90s-tastic, but also these were hot commodities in the 90s. Like, they had some budget for this.
I know, or they just really wanted to be part of this. I mean, I'd actually like to, hey, listeners, if any of you know, let us know. But also, I kind of feel like I'm going to go do some research, because a thing that I found fascinating, I didn't understand this as a kid, but that I found fascinating as I got older, is that all of those celebrity cameos on Batman 66 were basically volunteer efforts. Like, all of those celebrities loved that show so much that they were like, can I please come and poke my head out of a window while Batman and Robin are climbing up the side of a building, right? That's how that became the gag. People were begging to be on that show. And I wonder if maybe there was just a little bit of that with some of these, what might feel a little bit like stunt casting. Like, maybe they just really wanted to be part of the mythos,
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, you got to think, too, this was one of the more popular children's television shows of the time.
Oh, BTAS was huge, right? I mean, legitimately huge.
Right, and if you're Guilford, you're Guilford Godfrey. I don't think he had much of a his live action career was short lived, but his voice career went on much longer. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely got to be something to that.
So I wanted to say all the nice things about Mxyzptlk because I have a lot of not very nice things to say about her, or actually her portrayal. And I'm not going to beat this drum very much because you and I have had this conversation, but I think it's becoming clear that once you realize that Bruce Timm is a little pervy when it comes to the pinup girls. Like, I'm just going to lay it out there. If you're going to this much effort to put this many pinup girls into your children's television show, you might need to speak with your therapist a little bit about it, okay? Especially because, as near as I can tell, 90% of her job in this is to wear a bunch of different outfits that are all like classic pinup girl style outfits. And I don't know. I love so much of the rest of this episode that I just really get upset at how objectified this character is when she didn't even have to be in the episode, you know, which tells you she's 100% in here just to be objectified. And yes, it's been 25 years. Yes, you and I have harped on this, but I just got to say it. I don't like it. It really upsets me outside of the voice casting and the fact that she also periodically yanks the rug out from under Mxy.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't feel like she serves much of a purpose. And I don't know. We don't want to be a dead horse, but it's one of those trends that once you see it, it's kind of hard to unsee. And I guess, you know, watching it initially in the 90s or even rewatching it in the early aughts, you just don't catch how often they objectify women in the way they animate them and the way they voice them even, you know, it's just not a good feeling in this day and age, at least.
Yeah. I mean, look, I was a child, you know, a teen at this point, but still a child, and certainly not thinking the thoughts that I'm thinking now, but it is certainly not forgivable just because it's 25 years ago. In fact, I would say it is particularly not forgivable because it is so prevalent. Like, we just keep stepping on the rakes of objectified women on this show and new Batman adventures. And so, yeah, I'm going to let it go. But I had to say, she is kind of the downside to this episode to me. But considering the voice acting that they got for her, I should like it better. I should be happier about her inclusion. And I'm just not.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, Joshua.
So I have one other very deep cut comic book thing that I would like to point out to you that I virtually guarantee you did not see, and I think you'll enjoy it. So on the Kent farm, when Mxy is messing with Clark Kent and he makes the cat fly around, you may have noticed that is an orange cat with a white stripe. And the white stripe has a suggestion of a lightning bolt feel to it. Yes. That is 100% the coloration of Supergirl's pet cat, Streaky the Super Cat, who actually does get a cape and fly around and have superpowers. So that's not what's happening here, but that is a definite Easter egg for those of us in the know.
That's really funny that you mentioned that because obviously Streaky the Super Cat is not canon yet, but we know that Supergirl's coming. So
right.
Easter egg,
and she's going to spend more time on the farm, and she's going to be petting the cat. And I mean, we will see her on screen with that cat. I don't believe that they ever give the cat superpowers because we also don't get Crypto the super dog, and we don't get Beppo the super monkey, and we don't get Comet the super horse. Comet is not actually from Krypton. I just want to be clear. The rest of them are. Because Jor-El would just fire any damn thing into space, apparently.
Most definitely. I know. I think that was a nice nod, Joshua. Another just sort of acknowledgement I want to make is that I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, this is probably the first acknowledgement of multiple dimensions or the concept of multiple dimensions we've gotten in DCAU. Yeah. Maybe I'm wrong. Listeners can correct me if I'm wrong there as well, but I think this is the first time. Obviously, they don't really do anything with it, but that is something, a direction we're certainly going to go in down the road in the DCAU.
Hey, let's keep our eye on that, Caleb, because what I find really interesting about the way the DC universe approaches its various shades of multiverse is that higher dimensions are actually different than parallel Earths. So here's another little fun fact for you. Once you got Crisis on Infinite Earths, right? And you had a group of heroes that had been operating during World War II. That's the Justice Society of America, including an older version of Batman and Superman, right? And then you have, that's Earth 2. That becomes Earth 2 after Crisis. And Earth 1 is the main Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman that we're following around. They actually make it clear that the Mxy that you're more familiar with, the orange jumpsuit one, is the Mxy of Earth 1. So he is actually from Earth 1's fifth dimension, whereas if you went to Earth 2 and Mxy showed up, he would look like, or more like, the guy from this episode of the TV show. The Golden Age version.
That is very clever. See, it works. It works so that all of the Mxies are all the same Mxy?
Okay, they're never quite clear, right? So why does he choose to look different over there and act different over there than over here? I kind of choose to take an omniversal approach where each universe also has its own higher dimensions that are separate from the next universe's over higher dimensions.
Yes. Okay.
And so you could have a war of Mxies. Wouldn't that be amazing?
So Joshua, I can't decide. I'm gonna have to let this stew. I feel like my whole world has been shattered because now I'm trying to decide which version I like better, because I actually love the idea that you just put out there, but I also kind of like the idea of the same guy when he pops into different dimensions. You're seeing different type versions of him because it's all different, different dimension.
He's playing a different game every time, right? Yeah.
Oh man. Oh gosh, guys. Alternate, multiple dimensions, higher dimensions, mind blown. Think about it, or don't. Actually, don't. It'll hurt your head.
Or don't. I like to think about it because this is the kind of stuff I like to mess around with. But yeah, it can get real complicated real fast. And I'm not going to go into it now, but they have actually introduced something like an omniverse to the DC universe and also an underverse, so that there is an evil version of every good version also. It's wild. Just an excuse to tell any story you want, and I'm 100% behind that approach.
Googling the word omniverse.
All right, Caleb, I feel like that's as confusing as we need to get in this particular episode. Let's take a shift over to alternate media recommendations. Let's assume that people have enjoyed Mxyzpxilated as much as you and I have. What other things should they be reading, watching, playing, viewing, dealing with, trying to wrap their minds around fifth dimensional science of? What's your pick? Well,
I think, as always, and this wasn't my initial list, but just talking about multiple realities and multiple dimensions and how what one dimension looks like to another dimension, level of dimensions, just go read Slaughterhouse-5. It's a great classic piece of literature. It'll blow your mind if you haven't read it. It has certainly shaped and influenced a lot of the pop culture conversations around interdimensional beings. If I will. So that's number one. Secondly, if you really like the sort of golden age of comics vibe that I definitely got off of this episode, I have to go with a recent video game that's very, very popular. If you play games at all, you're probably familiar with it. It is Cuphead. It is what is referred to as a quote, and this is the name of the genre, a quote unquote bullet hell game. That it's one of those games where you're constantly getting barraged with like bullets from enemies. And in the case of this game, you're playing as a coffee cup Mickey Mouse type character. It looks like the Steamboat Willie cartoons and the golden age of comic influence is really, really strong. But essentially, you're getting shot at by giant vegetables that are shooting at you. The coffee cup character, hence the name Cuphead. Again, it's purely aesthetic, but if it got this episode, Mxyzpxilated gave me really strong vibes and nostalgia for that really much older type of animation we saw in the golden age of comics and also cartoons at that same time. So Cuphead, it's available on PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and PC, pretty much all the consoles. So if you have any interest in that type of aesthetic or nostalgia, check it out. Joshua, how about you?
Okay, first I want to agree with you about this Cuphead thing, just because in addition, I've never played it because I'm not that much of a video game guy, but I've seen it, and you're absolutely right about the aesthetic. But in the case of this episode, the aesthetic actually goes a little deeper because it sounds completely surrealist. Like the things you're doing in that game don't make sense. You know,
not at all.
Kind of like if Mxy were playing some pranks on you.
Ooh, I like that. So secretly, Mxy is behind Bullet. You know, I would totally buy it. So Cuphead is actually a spinoff of the DC universe because of Mxy. I buy it. He would do this sort of thing.
Headcanon is the best canon. So yeah, absolutely. I tipped my hand a little bit at the beginning because I wanted to know if you were familiar with Flatland, and I really would recommend it, even though it's a little novella from the 1880s. It really elevated my thinking when I was a much younger person. It's very clever. I really like it. I would recommend it, and it will help you kind of do some of that thinking of what would it look like if higher dimensional beings came to a lower dimension by putting us in the role, or beings like us, third dimensional beings in the role of the higher dimension beings. So great read. Please read Flatland. But I'm also going to break, I have kind of a rule of thumb where I try really hard not to recommend superhero stuff for my alternate media recommendations just because it's a little too easy. I mean, I've read this stuff my entire life, right? It's no problem. But I'm going to break that rule this time because there is a fantastic story written by Grant Morrison and drawn by Howard Porter from the oft-mentioned JLA run that I loved so much from the early 2000s. And the story is called Crisis Times 5, okay? Mxy is not in it, but it absolutely trades a ton in the mythology that's been built up around fifth dimensional imps and the various characters both in and adjacent to this tradition. So I mentioned Mxy's not the only one of these in the DC universe, right? You're familiar with Batmite, right? Am I right? Are you familiar with Batmite?
I am. I have heard the name Batmite.
So one of the many ways that Batman Brave and the Bold elbows its way to the top of my list of Batman cartoons is that it introduces Batmite and goes hard for it. And in another spectacular example of voice casting, he is voiced by Paul Rubens.
Oh, wait. I know who Batmite is. I take it back. I know exactly who Batmite is. Okay, Paul Rubens.
That brought it into focus. Yeah.
Yes.
I'd actually love to see a Batmite and Mxy crossover that was Paul Rubens and Gilbert Gottfried. Oh, my God. So what you may not realize is that in addition to that guy, you also have a similar character by the name of Quisp, who is basically the fifth dimensional imp that messed with Aquaman. And in addition to that, you have a character named Johnny Thunder from the Justice Society, who does not have a fifth dimensional imp, but he does have a genie, or what he calls a genie, which is a being that can do impossible things as long as he says his name frontways, and then he puts them away by saying it backways. Which they never say. They never make it clear that he's also fifth dimensional because he doesn't act like the rest of them. But that name thing is really interesting. Brought it all together in one story called Crisis Times 5, which manages to team up the Justice League with the Justice Society in a war against sentient colors.
I'm into it.
Fantastic. Now, I was having a little bit of a hard time nailing down the most cost-effective way to get this. So let me say, if you are a person who thinks that I know anything about good comic book recommendations, you should just buy the deluxe editions of Grant Morrison and Howard Porter's JLA. Just do that. It's in volume 3, I think. They're not cheap. They're hardcover. The paper is really good. The coloring is really good. I recommend that. But if you just want to dial in on Crisis Times 5, I think, I could not independently confirm this, but I believe the most cost-effective way to pick that up is like an $8 paperback of JLA Justice for All. Links to both the first volume of the deluxe edition of JLA and Justice for All are in the show notes. Make your own choices, friends. That about wraps it up for this animated discussion. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, come find us on Twitter. Caleb is at CMastersTalk, and I'm at Joshua Unruh, and the hashtag is Animated Discussion. Caleb, where else can people find you?
Well, Joshua, I'm the editor-in-chief and a contributor at the Mxyzptlk, a website that specializes in in-depth film critique and analysis. I also have a podcast, The Cinematic Schematic. We publish the podcast as well as these in-depth film essays on all types of different movies. And you can find those articles as well as the podcast at the Cinematropolis.com.
Remember that an animated discussion is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. Show your support by pledging at Patreon or by leaving a great review on Apple Podcasts to make it easier for more people to find us and join in the discussion.
And the links to the Patreon, Apple Podcasts, our recommendations, and Twitter are all very easy to find in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us for this animated discussion. We'll be back next time to talk about Animal Act on the new Batman Adventures.
Until next time, look! Up in the sky! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's an animated discussion!